I am now so excited to introduce our next speaker, Michael Saunders. Michael Saunders is a fourth-year science and business student at the University of Waterloo, whose interests sit at the intersection of climate resilience, innovation, and Caribbean identity. Raised in the Turks and Caicos Islands, Michael brings a lived awareness of how climate change and historical inequities shape the future of small island communities. His academic path blends biology, economics, and finance. Michael is also actively involved in entrepreneurial and research initiatives, ranging from tech innovation to sustainable development. Across these experiences, he is driven by a central question: how can historically overlooked regions transform vulnerability into opportunity and leadership? Please welcome Michael to the stage for his talk, The Short End of the Stick: How Caribbean Vulnerability Becomes Global Strength.
Where I'm from, we learn how to track hurricanes before we learn how to drive. Now that may sound like an exaggeration, but for 12-year-old me, preparing for Hurricane Irma, it was the reality. So let me pose a problem. How do you innovate in a region where countries can have their entire economies wiped out in a single night? Well, that question is where my story begins, in two small countries with large histories, the Turks and Caicos Islands and Guyana. My family is rooted in the Caribbean, but if you trace those roots back, you find ancestors taken from West Africa and India, shipped across oceans, and placed into systems built to extract their labor, but never to invest in their lives. They built economies that enriched distant empires, while their own communities were left with quite little. For centuries, the Caribbean has given more than it has received. That's what I call the short end of the stick. It's a system where one group carries the cost, while another captures the benefits. It's a story of resilience, but also a story of imbalance that still shapes the present. To understand why the Caribbean keeps getting the short end of the stick, we must look at how the stick was carved. Under colonialism, the Caribbean was not designed to build its own future. It was designed for exploitation. During slavery, the Caribbean became one of the most profitable engines for distant empires. Both flowed outward, very little stayed behind, and enslaved Africans were treated as replaceable labor driven to maximize output. After slavery, the plantation economy didn't collapse because it was wrong. It collapsed because they no longer had access to a controlled labor force. And emancipation left 4 million enslaved individuals without land, without capital, and without access to the foundations of economic independence. This is where indentured labor entered the region. Indian laborers entered a region in which the rules had already been written. Limited mobility, harsh penalties, and little chance at building generational wealth. But this is not only Caribbean history. This is my family story. Different histories, same system, still the short end of the stick. Both histories reveal a common truth, and that's that the systems imposed in the region were never designed for the residents who lived there. Not the indigenous communities who were there first, and not the laborers who were brought there through force. Across the region, the Caribbean was locked into narrow export economies. Think sugar, salt, coffee, and cotton. These economies were built for distant profit, not local resilience. From the very beginning, these economies were very fragile. So when we talk about the vulnerabilities in the region today, they didn't occur by chance. They were built into the system. Simply put, the tab was run up and the Caribbean paid the bill. But these imbalances didn't disappear. They changed shape. I want to pause here for a moment. This is a photo of me at just 12 years old sitting on my roof with my dad. We weren't up here to enjoy the view. We were up here repairing our home in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma and then preparation for Hurricane Maria. 2 hurricanes, 2 weeks, 2 Category 5s. In the Turks and Caicos Islands, Hurricane Irma shattered almost everything in its path. In 2017, we suffered from over $500 million in damages and losses, more than our entire national budget that year. Infrastructure failed and schools closed. Nearly 80% of critical homes and buildings were damaged, and some islands were left nearly destroyed. But Irma did more than just break buildings. It broke momentum, it broke development cycles, and it broke a sense of stability that communities have been building for decades. For me, living through Irma just 12 years old, I was taught something that sticks with me to this day. And that's that in the Caribbean, you don't just track hurricanes simply out of curiosity. You track them because your future depends on it. I remember being a grade 8 student. I remember sitting in class and seeing the joy on my classmates' faces after the light had turned on for the first time after being powerless in the weeks in the aftermath of Irma. And the sad part is that Irma was not an exception. From Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas to Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica, hurricanes are becoming less predictable, more destructive, and they're happening far later into hurricane seasons. Hurricanes are no longer just rare emergencies. They're structural events. They shape our economies, our infrastructure, our budgets, and our futures. But the impact doesn't just stop at buildings. It reaches our kitchens too. Across small island developing states, or SIDS, most countries fail to meet basic food requirements. Imports provide calories, but not always nutrition. So when storms hit, ports close, shipments stall, and prices rise. For countries that import most of their food, a storm anywhere in the supply chain can disrupt meals everywhere. Moreover, infrastructure brings its own vulnerabilities. Everything that keeps a society running, from airports to ports to schools to hospitals, costs more to build on islands because almost every material needs to be imported. And after storms, we pay again to rebuild, on top of already high costs. Between 1970 and 2020, SIDS lost over 150 billion US dollars due to extreme events. And after storms, debt rises. Today, most SIDS carry heavy debt levels. Many are already near debt distress, not because of mismanagement, but because vulnerability itself is priced into borrowing. The more exposed you are, the more you pay. That's the economic version of the short end of the stick. In the Caribbean, storms are where history and climate change collide, where inherited systems meet modern reality, and where the short end of the stick is no longer a metaphor. It shows up in dollars, in debt, in infrastructure, in food security, and in human lives. So after generations of absorbing these shocks, a pattern becomes clear. The Caribbean is not living with just isolated disasters. It is living with the accumulated weight of a system that never accounted for its well-being. And that brings me to the center idea of this talk, ecological debt. Ecological debt recognizes that the countries that grew wealthy through centuries of extraction and emissions carry a responsibility for the climate costs being faced to others. This is not about charity. This is about fairness. This is about balancing the ledger. Because right now, we are running the global economy like a credit card. The benefits are being enjoyed by the largest countries, while the bill is being sent to the smallest countries. But this is not just a metaphor. This is what the numbers show. Today, SIDS contribute to less than 1% of global emissions, yet they face some of the highest risks associated with climate change. In other words, the countries that did the least to create the crisis are paying the most for it. Ecological debt is not about waiting to be rescued. It means partnership. It means access to capital that reflects reality, not punishment for vulnerability. It means financing that understands that one storm can erase decades of progress, and that rebuilding stronger costs more than rebuilding fast. Acknowledging ecological debt does not diminish anyone's success. It corrects a system that's been out of balance for centuries. So this is not about looking backwards. This is about creating the conditions so that we all can move forward. The question now is whether the Caribbean continues to hold the short end of the stick, or if we finally reshape it. For generations, the region was defined by what was taken from us: land, labor, resources, stability. But what if the next chapter is defined by what we create? Because here's the truth. The same conditions that once positioned us to be vulnerable now position us to lead in resilience and in innovation. Well, across the region, that future is already starting to take place. In the Turks and Caicos Islands, the Blue Belt program is advancing our oceans, mapping our fragile reefs and strengthening our coastal defenses. In the Bahamas, they have committed to restoring over 1 million mangroves. These natural barriers absorb storm surges and shield entire communities. And in Guyana, the low-carbon development strategy is channeling revenues into protected forests and clean renewable energy, converting natural capital into long-term resilience. Innovation has always been a part of the Caribbean. What is new is the chance to scale it. Now, that's not just wishful thinking. It's already happening. What we need now is the investment that connects these solutions and multiplies the impact. Because the Caribbean is more than its vulnerability. It's a petri dish for innovation, a testing ground for the future. So the shift from exploitation to innovation is not symbolic. It is practical, it is necessary, and it is already underway. The Caribbean has carried the cost of a crisis that it did not create. So we're not here today asking for sympathy. We're asking for a seat at the global table. Not as observers, but as decision makers. For too long, the Caribbean has held the short end of the stick. Not by chance, but by design. Ecological debt is not about the past. It is about creating the conditions so that the countries and regions who are most vulnerable are not locked out of the solutions. And let me tell you, we know this future is possible, and I am so optimistic. Because what history shows us is that when countries and societies want to and are willing to move forward, we stand and rise united. So if we can innovate on the front lines of climate change, then the world can adapt and innovate with us. Where I'm from, we learn how to track hurricanes before we learn how to drive. We know how to navigate the storm. Now we are asking for the power to help shape what comes next. Thank you.
That was awesome, Michael. Hi, my name is Kelly, and I'm this year's VP Sponsorship. Now, I'd like to ask you a question. You talked about how innovation will help the Caribbean combat ecological debt. What is needed for other countries to do their part to fix the problem?
Thank you, Kelly. I think one of the most important things that we have to do is when international institutions and bodies are creating climate policy boards, it's important that we have Caribbean leaders sitting on those boards and advocating on behalf of the Caribbean from their region or their sub-region within the region. Because issues that are affecting certain areas of the Caribbean may not be affecting other regions. So it's very important to have multiple voices on the boards. And I think that's one of the most impactful, low-hanging fruits that we can do right now.
Thank you so much.